The Soviet Homeland Air Defense, in Russian Protivo Vozdushnaya Obrona, in short the PVO, in addition to the SAM systems which had been already presented on the channel, also operated fighters, many of which were unique. These fighters were used exclusively by the Homeland Air Defense and most of them were never exported anywhere. Let's take a look at their history. After World War II, in the German occupation zone and in Berlin, the Soviets witnessed firsthand the immense destruction that the American and British strategic bombers were capable of. The two nuclear bombs dropped on Japan at the end of the war further amplified the devastation to a previously unimaginable degree. A single bomber could now inflict a level of destruction that previously required hundreds or even thousands of four-engine bombers. The political climate quickly changed following World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union, who had been allies only out of necessity during the war. With the Soviet blockade of the Western-controlled occupation zones in Berlin, starting in summer of 1948, and its subsequent end, the Cold War era essentially began. The shift in foreign policy made the Soviet Union a target for American strategic bombers and British long-range bombers, along with the nuclear weapons they carried. This development led to the emergence of Soviet Homeland Air Defense fighters, which were developed and deployed alongside air defense missile systems. To understand what needed to be defended, it's helpful to take a quick look at the map. The majority of the Soviet Union's economy and population was concentrated in the western half of the country, roughly up to the Ural Mountains. Beyond that, to the east, with the exception of a few industrial centers, there was little more than an endless tundra and a generally unpopulated area. In Siberia, aside from a roughly east-west band along the route of the Trans-Siberian Railway, there were no major cities or important mining areas to the north or south. Accordingly, there were no significant air defense units stationed there either. In the Far East, aside from the areas around Vladivostok and Kamchatka, and the thin coastal strip, there were no cities or military bases that had to be defended. To the south, from the direction of the Caspian and Black Seas, the infrastructure density was similar to that of Moscow, Leningrad and Kiev regions. These boundary conditions determined the required range and size of the fighters, taking into account armament and capabilities of the bombers, which evolved over time. In the period following World War II, Soviet Homeland Air Defense fighters initially followed a path similar to the Homeland Air Defense fighters of the United States. The same fighter aircraft or slightly modified version of them were used both for Homeland Air Defense and by the frontline aviation. To shoot down large bombers, Soviet designers deemed it necessary to equip fighters with large caliber cannons. The first mass-produced fighter family, the MiG-15, was accordingly armed with two 24mm cannons and one 37mm cannon. This aircraft was essentially the Soviet counterpart to the American F-86 Sabre, but lacked a radar system and even radio-based rangefinder. Its armament did not include unguided air-to-air rockets, which was used on many American fighters. It relied on conventional cannons, however with greater firepower than those used in the World War II. However, this armament was not particularly effective against other fighters due to the cannon's low rate of fire and their differing ballistic properties. This flaw that became evident during the air combats of the Korean War. The first Soviet Homeland Air Defense fighter equipped with radar was the MiG-17P and PF and the Yak-25. The special feature of the Emerald, in Russian Izumrud radar, is that it had separate search and target tracking antennas like many SAM systems. The search antenna was not the usual one either. The antenna did not sweep in left-right direction, it was continuously rotated around an axis in one direction, like the radar of the S-25 Berkut SAM system. The antenna had a 60 degrees size scan zone in azimuth and 26 degrees size in elevation. With 60 kW transmit power, the antenna scanned this area in just 1.3 seconds. Thanks to the small antenna size and antenna peak power, the detection range of the radar was quite short. The maximum detection range was only 12 kilometers. It could detect an Il-28 bomber from a distance of only 7.5 kilometers. It was just as unsuitable for independent target search as early American airborne radars. The radar served only the target approach in the terminal phase and aiming with the guns. Before the terminal phase, the ground radars vectored the plane to the interception point. The target tracking antenna tracked only the log target with conical scanning. During target tracking, the search antenna did not transmit. This type of radar was used on the MiG-17P, PF, MiG-19P, PM and the Yak-25 fighters. The MiG-17 family is the direct evolution of the MiG-15. Their similarity is obvious at first sight. 5 variants of the MiG-17 family were produced, the basic, F, P, PF and PFU subvariants. The most produced base and the P variants were equipped with the VK-1A type engine without afterburner. The later F, PF and PFU variants had engine equipped with afterburner stage. From these, the P and PF types served in the PVO. The PFU version eventually never used at any active combat regiment. It was tested in 2 regiments, but they were discarded and forwarded to training regiment due to its inadequate air-to-air missile. Even with the use of afterburners, the MiG-17s were still unable to exceed the speed of sound in horizontal flight. The purpose of the afterburner was to improve acceleration and climb to assist in high-altitude turns when the fighter was already flying on the edge of its performance. The extra thrust was very useful for a short time to keep the fighter from slowing down when performed the turning behind the bomber at a very high altitude. In addition to radar, the MiG-17 PFU was the first Soviet fighter with a radar-guided air-to-air missile. The missile was the RS-1U, also known as the K-5 type missile. It was the first member of the K-5, or with the NATO code and name the AA-1 Alkali air-to-air missile family. It was fitted not only to the MiG-17 PFU, but also to the Yak-25K fighter, but ultimately neither fighter entered service. The inadequate detection range of the RP-1U radar and the too high minimum engagement range of the RS-1U missile made the complex unsuitable for practical use. For this reason, the MiG-17 variants which served in the PVO did not have an air-to-air missile. Thanks to these, only the P and PF variants were used by the PVO. In 1953, 178 MiG-17P airframes were produced and 706 P variants between 1954 and 1956. Both versions entered service in the year of the start of the production. The next mass-produced PVO fighters were the MiG-19P and PM. The MiG-19 is still a direct descendant of the MiG-15, the similarity is undeniable. Thanks to the improvements, the MiG-19 was able to reach speed of Mach 1.3 in horizontal flight without air-to-air missiles. The MiG-19P was equipped with a radar, but still did not have a radar-guided air-to-air missile. Thanks to the later upgrades, a part of the MiG-19P fleet received the short-range infrared-guided Air-3S missile, which is also known as K-13, or more commonly known as the AA-2A Atoll. With the RP-2U radar, the MiG-29 PM became capable of carrying the improved RS-2U, which is also known as K-5M missile. This was also a member of the AA-1 Alkali missile family. It could be used from a range between 1.5 and 3.5 kilometers. The missile could be launched only from the rear of the target within a very narrow zone. Side or head-on engagement were not possible. The missile used what is referred to in Russian terminology as a mechanical remote control. Some sources inaccurately describe this control method as a beam riding guidance. The core of the method is that a conical sweeping beam around the target emits a double pulse at every 90 degrees, and the repetition interval between the two pulses carries the information for the missile about which direction the target is relative to it. Essentially, this method only allowed the missile to engage essentially non-maneuvering targets from rear aspect. This early guidance, considering its very serious restrictions, quickly became obsolete. However, there was a price to pay to have missile armament. On the MiG-19 PM fighter, the cannons were sacrificed in exchange for the 4 RS-2U missiles. The fighter could carry 1 or 2 missiles under each wing. With 4 missiles, the aircraft was unable to exceed the speed of sound, and its range was significantly limited. The missile had essentially the size of a small bomb. It had a comparable aerodynamic drag plus the drag of the missile pylon. From 1956 to 1958, 443 MiG-19P, and between 1956 and 1960, 369 PM variants were manufactured. The PM variant with air-to-air missile armament entered service in November of 1957. Regarding the figures, it's important to note that they represent the total number of produced airframes, but not all of them were allocated to the PVO. For example, out of the 369 MiG-19 PMs produced, nearly 120 were exported. Therefore, approximately 240 MiG-19 PMs were shared between the frontline aviation and the PVO. This kind of split was not unique. There were several fighter aircraft types that were used both branches of the military. In the mid-1950s, the Yak-25 was developed with longer range, specifically for the needs of the PVO. Its appearance strongly reflects the concept of German World War II night fighters, like the special variant of the Junkers 88. The appearance of the Yak-25 is similar to a light bomber than a fighter jet. Its appearance made it obvious that it wasn't designed for use against other fighter jets. Long-range bombers were the only intended targets for this fighter. The Yak-25 was equipped with an RP-1D radar, which was the member of the Emerald radar family, with a maximum detection range of 12 km. Despite having a radar, the plane did not have any air-to-air missiles. Its weaponry consisted of two 37mm and 37L cannons, with a total of 100 rounds of ammunition. The rate of fire of the cannon was very low, only 400 rounds per minute, allowing a total of 15 seconds of continuous fire. The Yak-25M was later equipped with the RP-6 Falcon in Russian Sokol radar, with a maximum detection range of 16 km. However, its weaponry remained the same. The early series of the basic Yak-25 variant was produced only a limited quantity. Only 67 airframes were built. Following that, 406 M variant airframes were built. Both variants of the Yak-25 entered service in the same year when their production began in 1954 and 1955. Within the three fighter families discussed so far, the radars used the same basic technology, differing only in built-in equipment blocks. This is why the different radars were consistently named Emerald, only the type designations were different. These differences were due to the need to mount the instrument blocks and indicators in different locations, among other adjustments. However, from a tactical perspective, they essentially had the same capabilities. These fighter aircraft were designed to intercept subsonic or high subsonic speed bombers, such as the B-36, B-47 and the B-52 from the early 50s. However, by the mid-50s, the supersonic era for bombers was already on the edge of the horizon. The B-58 Hustler made its first flight in November of 1956, foreshadowing the deployment of the bombers capable of twice the speed of sound. This development posed a significant threat that the PVO could not ignore. Addressing this threat influenced several critical technical parameters, significantly raising the requirements for the successful interception. The emergence of the supersonic bombers demanded the significant increase of the maximum speed of the new fighters. This was not only desirable to shoot down targets from rear, but also to ensure that the fighters could get close enough in time to the target. For targets moving at faster than Mach 1, turning behind the target was inherently challenging and required very precise ground-controlled interception and maneuvering. This led to the demand of the head-on engagement capability with new radars and missiles. To achieve this, it required a dramatic increase in the detection range of radars. To illustrate the extent of this need, consider the following simple example. When a subsonic MiG-17 and the B-47 approached each other with a small aspect difference, in an almost head-on case, the relative speed was about 400 meters per second. The distance between them would decrease from 12 km to 0 roughly in 30 seconds, given the 12 km of radar detection range. If both the target and the fighter's speed were doubled, to maintain that the same 30-second time window, a radar detection range of around 30 km would be required. However, using more complex radar systems and missiles, the time needed for targeting and other operations increased, necessitating a minimum detection range of 40-50 km. Achieving such a detection range would fundamentally require an increase in transmitter power and larger antenna. However, a larger antenna also increases the frontal surface area of the aircraft, which increases the drag. To achieve higher speed, a new generation of afterburning turbojet engines were required, capable of providing the necessary thrust. Since these aircraft had relatively large frontal surfaces compared to smaller frontline fighters, compensating for this increased drag demanded even more thrust than previous models. Not only the higher demanded top speed was the origin of the higher thrust requirement. In the development of the Homeland Air Defense fighters, the missile era had a significant impact on their design philosophy. In 1933, Lavochkin and Tikhonov, the later chief designers of the Kub air defense missile system, proposed the idea that the role of the PVO fighter should be limited to delivering missiles close to the target. The fighter shall be controlled by an automated ground system rather than just providing information to the pilots from the ground. This idea was unfeasible at the time. However, this led to the development of such equipment which was capable of transmitting engagement commands to the pilot without radio speech. The first very primitive form of the data link was developed from this idea was the Lazur system. With the further redesign and upgrade of fighter aircraft at the end of the 50s, those types were simply unfeasible for this kind of encounters. Consequently, the PVO issued a requirement for the development of a supersonic interceptor capable of launching missile at a target 1000 km from its base, then returning home. But something remarkable happened on the 1st of May 1960. The failure to shoot down a U-2 with fighters, while the S-75 Desna system was successful, significantly shifted Khrushchev's attention towards the SAMs. By the end of the 50s, the air power component of the PVO faced the threat of this solution. The design phase of the new generation PVO fighter jet was launched with the looming threat in the background. When the design specification was formulated, it was already apparent that only significantly larger and heavier fighter designs would be able to fulfill the requirements, or at least to be close to the specified range and top speed with the desired radars and missiles. The new fighters were designed solely for the PVO. The increase in weight was not a unique phenomenon during the evolution of the fighters. The last American Homeland Air Defense fighters, the F-106, had an empty weight of 11 tons, while the F-102, which fell short of the original specification, weighed only about 9 tons. In contrast, even the heaviest MiG-19 variant weighed barely 5 tons. However, among the next generation of Homeland Air Defense fighters that entered service, even the lightest weighed 7.5 tons, and the heaviest was a staggering 24 tons. During the development of the second wave of Soviet Homeland Air Defense fighters, 3 main development directions eventually reached mass production and service. The high-altitude and high-speed capable planes were the Su-9 and Su-11, and the Su-15, which had a far smaller combat radius than the expected 1000 km. The first two types eventually served for only a short time due to their numerous issues. The long-range capability was represented by the Yak-25 and the Tu-128, the latter being the largest and heaviest fighter aircraft ever built. Both aircraft looked like bombers rather than traditional fighters. The pinnacle of this generation, and perhaps its paramount achievement, was the MiG-25 family. This aircraft managed to combine the advantages of the two previously mentioned groups, which was reflected in its high cost. While the MiG-17 and MiG-19 families were also used by the frontline aviation, the MiG-21 never adopted by the Homeland Air Defense. The Su-9 in essence was a scaled-up MiG-21. The later designed MiG-23 was eventually introduced into PVO alongside the MiG-25, but this was rather an undesirable necessity. Originally it was not planned to use any kind of MiG-23 by the PVO. An additional note regarding the weaponry. Despite the preference for head-on attack capability, all supersonic PVO fighters from the 60s were equipped with infrared guided air-to-air missiles either. However, until the second half of the 70s, infrared guided missiles were not capable of being launched from head-on or side aspects. Escort fighters along the bombers were not anticipated because of their inadequate range. The role of air defense fighters was merely to deliver the missiles within launch range, while they are being within the launch constraints. This approach was also largely true for classic fighters. Although dogfights between fighters required aiming, tracking and launching missiles during high G turns, this capability only became feasible in the mid-70s and in some respects not until the early 80s. The first types of the second wave were the Su-9 and its further development the Su-11. The service of these aircraft can be described only with one word: catastrophic. In the video about the F-104 Starfighter, we could have seen the accident and loss rate, which as a result the American fighter got the Widowmaker nickname, which in fact, considering its long service, had no basis. The German 104s, even when flying low altitude missions, managed to achieve a loss rate around 20 aircraft per 100,000 flight hours, roughly only one loss in every 5,000 hours, by the second half of their service, which spanned over 10 years. In contrast, for the Su-11, a single aircraft was lost due to an accident in every 2,100 hours, even in the 10th year after it entered service. The worst year was in 1961, when a Su-9 was lost in every 677 flight hours. It's clear that even compared to early types from the 50s, this attrition rate was simply horrifying. In addition to this, there were also airframe losses due to engine fires on the ground. The earlier MiG-19 and the later Su-15 had a loss rate roughly 6 times lower compared to the Su-9. Thanks to these terrible statistics, the service of the Su-9 and Su-11 was relatively short. The Su-9 was produced between 1958 and 1962, 1014 of them were built. As for the Su-11, only 108 were produced between 1962 and 1965. The Su-9 was equipped with a radar designed by the German engineers who had been taken to the Soviet Union following World War II. This radar was the CD-30, known by its codename SpinScan. Unlike the Emerald family, it had only a single Cassegrain antenna with a diameter of 60 cm. It had the same 60 kW transmitter power. Its maximum target detection range was 20 km. It could track a Tu-16 bomber-sized target from 16 km away. The Su-9 was armed with the RS-2 missile, which was modified to able to use with this radar. This missile still was the member of the AA-1 Alkali missile family with Western point of view. It was the final variant in this evolution line. The Su-9 entered service in 1956 with this missile without internal cannon. It was the lightest fighter among the second generation interceptors with an empty weight of 7.5 tons. The Su-11 was capable of reaching Mach 2 speed. Over the Su-9 it was equipped with a new radar system, the RP-11 Orel, known by its NATO codename Skipspin. Thanks to the new radar, the detection range against a Tu-16 bomber increased to 35 km. Besides the higher detection range, a new missile family became usable, the R-8M air-to-air missile, NATO codename AA-3NAB. This used a new type of guidance principle. It had semi-active radar guidance. But even with the new missile, head-on engagement still was not possible. As usual, the missile had an infrared guided variant. Like the Su-9, the Su-11 did not have an internal cannon, but thanks to the modification, it was about 1 ton heavier than the Su-9. Because of the catastrophic flight safety records, the first Su-9 equipped units started to discard and transitioned by another type at the end of 1966, when the production of the Su-11 had barely ended. These two ill-fated types essentially disappeared from the inventory of the PVO by the late 70s. The last unit that used Su-11 retired them in 1980, by which time they were already obsolete. In parallel with the production and deployment of the Su-11, the Yak-28P was also being manufactured and entered service. The Yakolev Design Bureau aimed to equip the Yak-28 bomber with the radar and armament of the Su-11. Their thinking was that if the Tupolev Bureau, traditionally known for designing bombers, could enter in the competition, then they should as well. Their concept clearly was the same as the heavy fighters had during World War II, like the German Junkers 88C and G variant, or the night fighter version of the English Mosquito. By August of 1960, the first prototype was completed, equipped with the infrared guided variant of the R-8M missile, although the Aurel radar had not yet been installed in the aircraft. Despite this, the tests were successful, with 4 out of 5 targets being shot down. The test targets were infrared bombs suspended by parachutes and remotely controlled IL-28 medium bombers. In November of 1960, during tests conducted with the 2 radar-guided R-8M missiles, the 11-ton fighter reached a maximum altitude of 18,000 meters and a speed of 1,950 km per hour, flying at an altitude at 12,000 meters. The government was so satisfied with these results that it ordered the serial production of the Yak-28 in November of 1961. From this point on, the events took an interesting turn. The official military acceptance of the aircraft had not yet taken place at the time, and it never happened. By the end of 1962, serial production has started in parallel with the state acceptance by the armed forces. Testing was continued until 1964. Although the fighter met the specifications, it was never officially commissioned in service, despite the fact that the planes were used for more than 2 decades and a total of 630 Yak-28P airframes were produced. So it cannot be said that the Yak-28P was some insignificant small serial produced fighter like the failed MiG-17 PFU was, but it has to be underlined it was far from being good. The Yak-28P had numerous technical issues. For example, its ejection seats were extremely unreliable. Flying the aircraft was also challenging as it lacked flaps, which led to the very high landing speed. Additionally, the engine's power could not be reduced below 62%, which required careful handling the thrust during the already lengthy approach and landing process. The Yak-28 was an unreliable aircraft, like many other planes from its era. It was primarily used due to its significantly longer range compared to the PVO fighters of the early 60s. The Yak-28 featured a 2-person crew, consisting of a pilot and a radar operator navigator, unlike the single-seat Su-9 and Su-11 and the later introduced Su-15. This aircraft served the long arm of the PVO, units with the Yak-28P generally stationed far and remote regions before more advanced new fighters were introduced. It was used out of necessity as there were few alternatives. Its top speed was around Mach 1.7. The Yak-28 had a significant shortcoming. Its radar was unsuitable for intercepting low-speed, low-flying targets, and it did not have guns. As a result, until the mid-70s, regiments equipped with the Yak-28P often had 1 or 2 squadrons with only cannon-armed MiG-70s and or MiG-19 squadron. Since virtually all bombers at low altitude could only fly at subsonic speed, the range and top speed of the other MiG models were sufficient for this gap-filling role. The last units retired the Yak-18P in the mid-80s. To replace the disastrous Su-9 and Su-11, became necessary to introduce a new plane, which turned out to be the Su-15. Despite being a single-seat fighter, its empty weight exceeded 11 tons. The limitations of the Soviet engine development are clearly visible on the Su-15. The American F-106 with the same empty weight could reach Mach 2 even with a single engine. In contrary, the Su-15 required 2 engines to do the same. Another interesting feature is that unlike the American F-102 and F-106 and the Canadian CF-105, which never entered service, the fighters of the PVO were designed without a weapons bay. The radar of the Su-15 was essentially a further development of the RP-11 Aurel radar used on the Su-11, It was designated as the RP-15 due to the new platform. The air-to-air armament also got an upgrade. The Su-15 was equipped with the R-98R and the R-98T missiles, which were further development of the R-8M. Originally it had the R-8M2 designation. The R-98R was a semi-active radar-guided missile, while the R-98T was an infrared-guided. The NATO designation and name for these air-to-air missiles were still AA-3 NAB. The Su-15 turned out to be a well-designed fighter aircraft, in stark contrast to the problematic Su-9 and Su-11. However, it fell significantly short to the 1000 km mission radius requirement. With a full afterburner maximum performance profile, its combat radius was only 295 km. Even with subsonic interception profile, the combat radius still was only 590 km. A total of 564 Su-15s were produced between 1966 and 1971. Following the base variant, a total of 441 airframes of the upgraded T and TM variants were built between 1970 and 1975. The T variant was used only for training and testing purposes, while combat squadrons only flew the TM variant. The upgraded versions were equipped with the semi-active R-98 AMAR and the infrared-guided R-98MT missiles. Both the T and TM variants were delivered with the new RP-26 Typhoon radar. This is the reason for the letter T in the aircraft's designation. The detection range against 216 size targets increased to about 70 km. The TM variant not only received the new radar, the short-range R-60 missile family in the late 70s also were integrated. This could be carried alongside the R-98M missiles. The aircraft top speed exceeded twice the speed of sound, even when it carried two large missiles. The Su-15 is relatively unknown to the greater public, as many other PVO fighters, because it was never used in combat. Compared to, we can say, elegant-looking 4th generation US or Soviet fighters, many people find its appearance quite clunky and awkward. No matter its appearance from the Soviet viewpoint, the aircraft was successful. Its flight safety statistics far exceeded the Su-9 and Su-11 with significantly better combat capabilities. The Su-15 gained attention and got quite a negative reputation due to the two incidents. The first occurred in 1978, the second in 1983, when Su-25s downed commercial passenger planes due to navigation errors. The first incident involved the Korean Air Flight 092, where the two people were killed, but the aircraft managed to make an emergency landing. The more infamous incident was downing the Korean Air Flight 007. In that case were no survivors. This incident pushed the Cold War into one of the darkest periods. There was also a lesser-known third incident involving the Su-15. In 1981, a Su-15 collided with an Argentine-registered Canadair CL-44 cargo plane while intercepting it after it violated Soviet airspace over Azerbaijan. Whether the collision was intentional or not remained unclear. Western experts suggest that the pilot made an error and attempted to cover up his mistake by claiming the collision was deliberate. The Su-15TN remained service until the end of the Cold War, but at the time it was only used by a few units in Russia. In 1993, the last of them was retired. We have now reached perhaps one of the most unique fighter aircraft ever designed. The Tu-128 truly looks like it was designed by a team accustomed to designing bombers in terms of size, weight and appearance. The aircraft's enormous size was justified by the required 1000 km combat radius. Simply, there was no other way to achieve the demanded range because of the limited specific performance of the Soviet turbojet engines. At subsonic speeds, the Tu-128's combat radius reached 1250 km. The huge fighter was primarily designed for regions without ground radar coverage, for the vast airspace of Siberia and the northern seas, where it was necessary to perform independent target search and engagement. Regardless the size of the Tu-128, it did not have internal weapons bay despite its bomber-like appearance. It carried the huge R-4 missiles under its wing, two on each side could be carried. These missiles could be either infrared or radar guided. The R-4 was the first Soviet beyond visual range air-to-air missile designed with semi-active radar and infrared homing versions. Its NATO designation was AA-5-Ash. The R-4 was exclusively developed to the Tu-128, it never was used on any other aircraft. The RP-28 Smerch, an English Tornado radar with the NATO reporting name Big Nose, served as a basis for the design of later Soviet air defense fighter radars. The radar provided a detection range of about 50 km against the Tu-16 sized target. The 1000 km range was achieved by reducing the top speed compared to the other fighters. While the Su-11 and the Su-15 could reach Mach 2, the Tu-128's top speed when carrying missiles was only around Mach 1.6, like the Yak-25 had. Despite lowering the top speed requirement, it still had an empty weight of 24.5 tons. The Tu-128 is still the heaviest fighter plane which ever had been designed. A total of 199 airframes were produced between 1964 and 1971, including a few training variants. Due to the modest manufactured quantity, only 5 regiments were equipped with the huge plane. By the second half of the 80s, they were replaced by the MiG-31, except one case where the MiG-25P replaced the Tu-128 in 1975. The story of the PVO fighter jets did not end here, it will be continued in the next episode. If you like the video, you can share, like, subscribe or ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support it via Patreon for exchange for early access, voting on plan topics and extra content and updates about the project. So far, 10 Patreon extra content has been released, their description are in the link under the video.